The convoy never heard them coming. 6 jeeps materialized from the tree line at dawn, moving fast across frozen ground, their engines muffled by distance and morning fog. By the time the German truck drivers realized what was happening, the jeeps were already firing, not rifle-caliber rounds or light machine gun bursts, but heavy .50 caliber tracers that punched through truck panels like paper and ignited fuel tanks in rolling fireballs. The lead vehicle exploded, blocking the road. The rear truck tried to reverse and took a sustained burst to the cab that killed the driver and sent the vehicle careening into a ditch. In 90 seconds, 12 vehicles were burning, their cargo scattered across snow that turned black with oil and red with blood. Then the jeeps were gone, vanishing back into the forest before German infantry could organize a response. Survivors stumbled from wrecked trucks, ears ringing, faces scorched, staring at the tree line where the attackers had disappeared. One sergeant, a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd survived Stalingrad and thought he'd seen every variation of mechanized warfare, muttered a phrase that would spread through Wehrmacht ranks over the coming weeks. Eiserne Wespe. Iron Wasp. Small, fast, deadly, striking without warning and disappearing before you could retaliate. The Americans had turned utility vehicles into hunter-killers, and the roads of France and Germany would never be safe again. The Jeep was never designed for combat. Officially designated the Willis MB, it was conceived in 1940 as a lightweight reconnaissance and utility vehicle, a motorized replacement for motorcycles and horses that could carry personnel, supplies, and communications equipment across rough terrain. The specifications call for a vehicle weighing under 1,300 pounds, capable of carrying 600 pounds of payload, with four-wheel drive and enough ground clearance to navigate obstacles that would stop conventional trucks. Willis Overland and Ford both produced versions, churning out over 600,000 units between 1941 and 1945. The Jeep became ubiquitous, used by every branch of the American military, and supplied to Allied forces through Lend-Lease. It was rugged, reliable, simple enough that field mechanics could repair it with basic tools, and versatile enough to serve in roles far beyond its original design parameters. By 1944, Jeeps were everywhere in the European theater, ferrying officers between headquarters, towing light artillery, serving as ambulances, carrying supplies to forward positions. But they were fundamentally unarmored, lightly built vehicles designed for transportation, not direct combat. The idea of mounting heavy weapons on them seemed impractical at best and suicidal at worst. Heavy machine guns required stable platforms to absorb recoil. They needed ammunition supply which added weight. They generated heat that could warp barrels during sustained fire. And most critically, using them effectively required exposing the crew to enemy fire without the protection of armor. Standard doctrine called for mounted machine guns on half-tracks or armor cars, vehicles with at least some ballistic protection, and the weight to handle sustained firing. Putting a .50 caliber Browning on a Jeep violated engineering principles and tactical sense. But engineering principles and tactical doctrine hadn't accounted for the resourcefulness of soldiers facing problems that textbooks didn't address. The first armed Jeeps appeared in North Africa, cobbled together by maintenance crews who mounted captured weapons or salvaged machine guns on improvised pintle mounts. These were expedients, not official modifications. Units operating in fluid desert conditions needed mobile firepower for convoy security and perimeter defense, and Jeeps were available when armored vehicles weren't. The British Long Range Desert Group had pioneered similar concepts with their heavily armed trucks, conducting raids deep behind enemy lines using speed and firepower to overwhelm isolated positions before retreating into the desert. American units observed these tactics and adapted them, creating ad hoc gun jeeps that proved surprisingly effective in specific roles. By the time Allied forces invaded Sicily and Italy, multiple units had standardized unofficial modifications. Reinforced mounts welded to jeep frames, ammunition boxes secured offenders, and improvised armor plates protecting drivers and gunners from small arms fire. These vehicles weren't intended for frontline combat, but rather for security patrols, convoy escort, and quick reaction to infiltrators or saboteurs. They worked well enough that after-action reports began mentioning them favorably, noting that mobile machine gun platforms provided flexible fire support without requiring the fuel consumption and maintenance demands of half-tracks. Still, higher headquarters remained skeptical. The vehicles were fragile, the crews exposed, and tactical employment was limited to permissive environments where enemy response would be minimal. Nobody was suggesting using gun jeeps against prepared positions or mechanized forces. That changed in France. The breakout from Normandy in late July 1944 transformed the battlefield. Operation Cobra shattered German defensive lines, and American armored divisions exploded through the gap into open country, where mobility mattered more than defensive fortification. Tank columns raced east and south, cutting supply lines and bypassing strong points that would have required weeks to reduce in static warfare. But the rapid advance created problems. Supply lines stretched thin as logistics struggled to keep pace with frontline units advancing 20 or 30 miles per day. German forces, though retreating, remained dangerous, particularly small units operating independently to harass American rear areas. Convoys carrying fuel, ammunition, and food became priority targets for German raiders who used hit-and-run tactics to destroy supplies and then disappear before reinforcements arrived. Truck drivers, mechanics, and support personnel suddenly found themselves in combat situations they weren't trained for, facing enemy soldiers who materialized from forests or villages, attacked, and vanished. The armored divisions couldn't spare tanks for rear security. They needed every combat vehicle for the advance. Infantry units were spread across miles of front with no reserves to guard logistics routes. Military police and rear echelon troops lacked the firepower or training to counter determined attackers. The situation demanded a solution that could provide mobile, effective firepower without diverting frontline assets. Some enterprising officers looked at the hundreds of jeeps shuttling between supply depots and forward positions and saw potential. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington, commanding officer of a logistics battalion supporting 3rd Army's advance, was one of the first to formalize the concept. His convoys had been hit 3 times in 2 weeks. German infantry with Panzerfaust rockets and machine guns ambushing trucks on isolated stretches of road, destroying vehicles and killing drivers before melting into the countryside. Harrington's battalion had organic security, a handful of .30 caliber machine guns mounted on trucks, and a platoon of infantry riding in the convoy. But it wasn't enough. The attacks came too fast and from too close, hitting the convoy before guards could dismount and return fire effectively. Harrington needed weapons that could engage immediately from moving vehicles, with enough firepower to suppress or kill attackers before they could inflict serious damage. He requisitioned 3.50 caliber Browning machine guns from an ordnance depot, pulled 3 jeeps from the motor pool, and had his maintenance section fabricate reinforced pedestal mounts welded directly to the jeep frames. The mounts were crude but functional. Heavy steel plates bolted to the floor with a rotating collar that allowed the gun to traverse and elevate. Ammunition storage was solved by strapping M2 ammo cans to the fenders and rear deck, each can holding 105 rounds of linked .50 caliber. The gunner stood behind the weapon, feet braced on the floor, hands gripping the butterfly trigger. The driver controlled movement, responding to the gunner's directions. A 3rd man, usually riding in the passenger seat, served as spotter and assistant, helping reload and scanning for threats the gunner might miss. The first operational test came on August 15th, when a convoy carrying aviation fuel for Patton's tank columns received intelligence warning of probable ambush on the route ahead. Harrington positioned his 3 gun jeeps as outriders, one leading the convoy, one trailing, one running parallel through fields when terrain allowed. The convoy moved at moderate speed, drivers watching for obstacles, the jeep gunners scanning tree lines and buildings. 20 minutes into movement, the lead jeep spotted German soldiers setting up a roadblock. Fallen tree across the pavement, machine gun team in position behind cover, infantry spreading into flanking positions. Standard ambush tactics. The driver hit the accelerator, charging directly toward the roadblock while the gunner opened fire. The .50 caliber Browning thundered, sending tracers ripping through trees and sandbags. The German machine gun team died before they could fire a shot. Infantry scattered, some returning fire with rifles that were hopelessly outranged by the heavy machine gun. The jeep swung broadside to the roadblock, giving the gunner a clear field of fire, and methodically destroyed the position. Walking round through suspected hiding spots, chewing apart the felled tree, suppressing movement with short bursts that conserved ammunition while maintaining fire superiority. The other two gun jeeps arrived seconds later, flanking the ambush position and catching retreating Germans in a crossfire. Within 3 minutes, the fight was over. 11 enemy dead. For captured, the rest fled into the forest. American casualties, 0. Damage to convoy, none. Harrington's after-action report praised the gun jeep's effectiveness and recommended immediate expansion of the concept. Word spread through informal channels. Officers talking to peers, maintenance crews sharing technical details, soldiers writing letters home, describing the vehicles they'd seen. By September, multiple units across Third Army were fielding improvised gun jeeps, each with slight variations depending on available materials and crew preferences. Some mounted twin .50 caliber guns for increased firepower. Others added makeshift armor. Quarter-inch steel plates bolted to the dashboard and sides, providing limited protection against small arms fire while keeping weight manageable. A few experimental vehicles mounted .30 caliber machine guns in addition to the primary .50 caliber, giving the crew a lighter weapon for suppressive fire that consumed less ammunition. The most elaborate conversions included radios for communication, camouflage netting to break up the vehicle's silhouette, and storage racks for extra ammunition, fuel, and water. None of these modifications were officially authorized. Ordnance officers worried about voiding warranties and creating maintenance nightmares. Logistics planners complained about the diversion of weapons and materials from approved uses. But commanders in the field, dealing with daily attacks on supply lines and mounting casualties among non-combat personnel, ignored the bureaucratic objections. The gun jeeps worked. They saved lives and protected critical supplies. That was justification enough. The crews who operated these vehicles developed tactics through trial, error, and hard experience. Early operations revealed vulnerabilities. Jeeps were fast but fragile. Direct hits from rifle rounds could disable engines or puncture fuel tanks. The gunner was completely exposed, standing upright to operate the weapon, visible to any enemy observer. The vehicle's speed made it difficult to aim accurately while moving, and stopping the fire made it a stationary target. Ammunition consumption was enormous. The .50 caliber Browning fired at over 500 rounds per minute, and extended engagements could exhaust onboard supply within seconds. The gun generated tremendous heat during sustained fire, requiring barrel changes that took precious seconds and left the crew defenseless. These problems didn't make the vehicles ineffective, but they demanded new tactical approaches. Crews learned to attack from unexpected angles, using terrain to mask their approach until the last moment. They perfected shoot-and-move techniques, firing short bursts while in motion, then relocating before enemy return fire could find a mark. They worked in pairs or trios, with one jeep engaging while others maneuvered to flanking positions, creating crossfires that overwhelmed enemy defenses. They studied German tactics and learned to recognize ambush sites before entering kill zones, either bypassing them or attacking preemptively. The most successful crews developed an almost instinctive coordination between driver and gunner, the driver anticipating the gunner's needs and positioning the vehicle without verbal commands, the gunner trusting the driver to keep them moving and alive while he focused on targets. Sergeant Eugene Kowalic became one of the most proficient gun jeep commanders in Third Army. A former truck driver from Detroit, he'd enlisted in 1942 and spent 2 years in logistics units before volunteering for gun jeep duty in August 1944. He had no infantry training and minimal combat experience, but he understood vehicles and had a natural sense for terrain and movement. His driver, Private Eddie Delacroix, was a Louisiana farm boy who could coax performance from engines that other mechanics declared dead. His gunner, Corporal Sam Harding, was a Pennsylvania coal miner with steady hands and the patience to wait for perfect shots rather than wasting ammunition on suppressive fire. Together, they formed one of the most effective gun jeep crews in the European theater, credited with over 30 successful engagements and an unknown number of enemy casualties. Kowalic's tactical philosophy was simple. Never fight fair. Never stay in one place. Never let the enemy predict your movements. Hit hard, hit fast, and be gone before they can react. His crew embodied these principles in every operation. Their first major engagement came in mid-September, during Third Army's advance toward the German border. Kowalcik's Jeep was part of a four-vehicle team assigned to patrol a 20-mile stretch of highway connecting supply depots with forward divisions. Intelligence reported German units operating in the area, likely a company-sized element conducting harassment operations. Standard patrols had been ambushed twice in the previous week, suffering casualties and losing vehicles. Kowalcik's orders were to locate enemy positions, engage if advantageous, and call for reinforcements if contact exceeded the team's capability. They rolled out at dawn, for jeeps moving in loose formation with 50-yard intervals. The morning was cold and damp, fog clinging to low ground, visibility limited to 100 yards. They drove slowly, listening for engine sounds or voices, watching for tire tracks or disturbed vegetation that might indicate recent enemy movement. 3 miles into patrol, Delacroix spotted smoke rising from woods south of the highway. Thin gray column barely visible through the fog. Kowalcik signaled the other jeeps to halt, while he studied the smoke through binoculars. Campfire, maybe a quarter-mile into the trees. Could be civilians, refugees, or rear echelon American troops. Or it could be Germans. He made the decision to investigate. The jeeps left the highway and followed a dirt track into the forest, moving slowly to minimize engine noise. The track curved through dense pines, visibility dropping to 50 feet, the fog thickening in the shadows. Kowalcik felt exposed. If they were ambushed here, there'd be no room to maneuver, no way to use speed as defense. But they were committed now, and pulling back without confirming the smoke's source meant abandoning intelligence that could be critical. They pushed forward for 5 minutes, tension mounting with every yard. Then the track opened into a clearing, and Kowalcik saw the source of smoke. German supply trucks, 6 of them, parked in a rough circle with soldiers clustered around fires, eating breakfast and brewing coffee. Not a combat unit prepared for contact, but logistics detachment resting between movements. Kowalcik had seconds to decide, attack or withdraw, 4 jeeps against maybe 40 soldiers. No element of surprise because the Germans would hear engines any second. But the enemy was relaxed, weapons stacked against trucks instead of being carried. No sentries posted because they thought they were operating in safe rear areas. Kowalcik made a gambler's choice. He signaled attack. The 4 jeeps burst into the clearing in line abreast, accelerating to full speed, machine guns opening fire simultaneously. The effect was catastrophic. Soldiers dove for cover, scrambling for weapons, shouting warnings that were drowned by the hammering roar of .50 caliber fire. Trucks erupted in flames as tracers ignited fuel and ammunition. Men caught in the open were cut down before they could reach cover. The Germans tried to organize a defense, but the jeeps were moving too fast, circling the clearing like wolves around cornered prey, firing from different angles and never presenting stationary targets. Harding worked his gun with brutal efficiency. Short bursts into groups of soldiers, longer bursts into truck cabs and cargo beds, methodical fire that conserved ammunition while inflicting maximum damage. Delacroix drove like he was racing dirt tracks back home, sliding through turns, accelerating between shots, positioning the jeep so Harding always had targets and never stayed exposed for more than seconds. The other jeeps executed the same tactics, coordinating without radio communication through pure situational awareness and shared training. Within 2 minutes, the clearing was a slaughter pen. Bodies sprawled around burning trucks. Survivors fleeing into the forest. Resistance collapsing into panic and rout. Kowalcik ordered ceasefire, and the jeeps withdrew, racing back down the track before German reinforcements could respond. They reached the highway and continued patrol as if nothing had happened, though Harding's gun barrel glowed red, and the air around the jeep stank of cordite and hot metal. The raid exemplified gun-jeep tactics at their most effective. Speed and surprise substituted for armor and numbers. Aggressive action overwhelmed enemy decision-making before organized resistance could form. Coordinated fire from multiple vehicles created devastating crossfires that amplified individual firepower. And rapid withdrawal prevented counterattack, leaving the enemy to deal with casualties and damage while the attackers disappeared. Kowalczyk's after-action report was brief. Contact with enemy logistics element. 6 vehicles destroyed, estimated 35 casualties. no friendly losses, ammunition expenditure within acceptable limits. Higher headquarters noted the report and filed it with dozens of others describing similar engagements. But among gun jeep crews, the raid became legendary, proof that aggressive tactics and skilled crews could punch far above their weight class. German intelligence took longer to recognize the pattern. Early reports described attacks by armored vehicles or light tanks. Officers assumed that only tracked, armored platforms could mount heavy machine guns and conduct sustained combat operations. When prisoners contradicted this, claiming they'd been attacked by small, fast vehicles with minimal or no armor, intelligence officers dismissed the accounts as confusion or exaggeration. But as reports accumulated through September and October, the pattern became undeniable. American units were fielding large numbers of armed utility vehicles, using them for aggressive patrolling and convoy raids that inflicted disproportionate casualties. German soldiers began calling them camp jeeps, battle jeeps, or more commonly, Eiserne Wespe, iron wasps, because they struck like stinging insects, sudden, painful, and difficult to swat. The nickname spread through Wehrmacht ranks, appearing in unit diaries and intelligence summaries. Tactical bulletins warned troops to treat any jeep as potentially armed and dangerous, to engage immediately rather than assuming it was a logistics vehicle. Anti-ambush doctrine was revised to account for the possibility that American convoys might include heavily armed outriders capable of immediate, overwhelming response. But countermeasures were difficult to implement. The gun jeeps operated unpredictably, appearing in locations where doctrine said support vehicles shouldn't be, attacking with firepower that seemed excessive for their size. They rarely stayed in one area long enough for German forces to pattern their movements or set traps. And by late 1944, Wehrmacht units were too stretched and under-resourced to dedicate significant assets to hunting individual vehicle teams. The gun jeep's psychological impact exceeded their material destruction. German soldiers operating in rear areas, drivers, supply personnel, communications troops, began experiencing the same fear and vulnerability that American logistics units had felt during the summer. Roads became dangerous. Rest areas weren't safe. The possibility of sudden, violent attack created constant stress that degraded morale and effectiveness. Truck drivers demanded armed escorts for routine supply runs, tying up infantry that was desperately needed at the front. Rest camps had to be fortified and guarded, diverting resources from offensive operations. The fuel and ammunition that did reach frontline units arrived later and in smaller quantities because drivers took circuitous routes to avoid areas where gun jeeps had been reported. This was asymmetric warfare in its purest form. Small, relatively cheap weapon systems, creating effects far beyond their physical capabilities by disrupting enemy logistics and eroding confidence. The psychological dimension of the gun jeep's effectiveness was never quantified in official reports, but soldiers on both sides understood it instinctively. Fear is a weapon as potent as explosives, and the Iron Wasps wielded it masterfully. By November 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward Germany's western border and winter weathered degraded mobility across the front, gun jeep operations evolved again. The fluid, mobile warfare of the summer and fall gave way to grinding attritional battles in forests and fortified zones, where speed mattered less than sustained firepower. Gun jeeps adapted by shifting roles from offensive raiding to defensive screening and rapid response. They patrolled perimeters of Allied-held towns, interdicting German infiltrators and reconnaissance teams. They supported infantry advances by providing mobile fire support that could reposition faster than towed weapons. They conducted harassment fire against German positions at night, denying rest and forcing defenders to man fighting positions continuously. The crews developed cold weather techniques, wrapping gun actions in cloth to prevent ice buildup, mixing fuel with additives to prevent gelling, wearing layered clothing that allowed movement while protecting against frostbite. The vehicles themselves suffered in winter conditions. Batteries died in sub-zero temperatures. Tires lost traction on ice, and engines required prolonged warming before they'd run reliably. But the crews adapted because the mission demanded it. Kowalic's team operated through the bitter winter of 1944 to 1945, conducting patrols and raids in conditions that grounded aircraft and bogged down tanks. On a frozen morning in mid-December, they intercepted a German column attempting to infiltrate American lines during the opening phase of the Ardennes offensive. The column consisted of trucks carrying infantry, moving under cover of darkness along a secondary road that intelligence hadn't marked as active. Kowalcik's jeep was part of a two-vehicle patrol running parallel to the front lines when they spotted vehicle lights moving slowly through the forest. They shadowed the column for 15 minutes, confirming its direction and composition, then radioed for reinforcements while positioning for ambush. The second jeep moved ahead to block the road, while Kowalcik's vehicle attacked from the flank. The ambush was textbook. First burst into the lead truck's engine block, immobilizing the vehicle and blocking the road. Subsequent fire raked the column from front to back, killing drivers and puncturing fuel tanks. German infantry dismounted and tried to establish a perimeter, but they were silhouetted against burning trucks while the gun jeeps fired from darkness. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes before the Germans broke and fled into the forest, abandoning vehicles and equipment. When reinforcements arrived 20 minutes later, they found 9 destroyed trucks, 37 German dead, and a scattered trail of abandoned weapons marking the enemy's retreat. Kowalcik's team suffered 1 casualty. Delacroix took shrapnel in the arm from a German grenade. Not serious enough for evacuation, but sufficient to earn a Purple Heart. They were back on patrol the next day. The Ardennes offensive created the gun jeep's finest hour and their greatest challenge. German forces attacking through the Ardennes forest needed to move quickly and supply their advance continuously, creating long, vulnerable logistics tails through terrain that favored ambush. American gun jeeps operated throughout the battle zone, attacking convoys, raiding supply dumps, and generally creating chaos in German rear areas. They couldn't stop the offensive. The German assault was too massive and too well prepared. But they imposed friction and delay that bought critical time for American forces to organize defenses. German commanders reported constant harassment from mobile American units that struck without warning and disappeared before reinforcements could respond. Fuel convoys especially suffered, with dozens of trucks destroyed or abandoned when their escorts were engaged by vehicles the Germans couldn't catch or effectively counter. The impact on German logistics during the Ardennes fighting was never precisely calculated, but post-war analyses suggested that supply difficulties contributed significantly to the offensive's ultimate failure. The Iron Wasps weren't decisive, but they were consequential, one factor among many that degraded German operational capability at a critical moment. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, gun jeeps had become institutionalized. What began as improvised field modifications had evolved into semi-official standard configurations, with ordnance units manufacturing mounting kits and distributing them to requesting units. The vehicles were still fragile and the crews still exposed, but tactics had matured to the point where properly employed gun jeeps could accomplish missions that would require significantly larger forces using conventional methods. They screened armored advances, protecting flanks and rear areas from infiltrators. They conducted reconnaissance in force, probing enemy positions and withdrawing before committing heavier units. They provided mobile fire support for infantry clearing towns and villages, positioning at intersections to cover multiple streets, and engaging targets that conventional infantry weapons couldn't suppress. And they continued raiding, hunting German convoys and supply lines in a reversal of roles from the summer of 1944, when American logistics had been the primary target. German forces retreating across their homeland faced the same fear and disruption that their raiding parties had once inflicted. The psychological symmetry was noted by few at the time, but it represented a fundamental shift in the war's momentum. Kowalcik's crew fought through the final weeks of the European War, participating in the encirclement of the Ruhr Pocket and the race across central Germany. They witnessed the collapse of organized German resistance, units surrendering en masse, refugees clogging roads, cities burning from bombing and artillery. In late April, their jeep was patrolling near the Elbe River when they encountered a German supply column abandoned intact. Trucks full of rations, ammunition, and fuel left by crews who deserted or fled east toward Russian lines. Kowalcik reported the find, and follow-on units secured the supplies, but the discovery epitomized the war's end. Germany's military machine had exhausted itself, and the Iron Wasps no longer had targets worth stinging. When Germany surrendered on May 8th, Kowalcik's jeep was parked in a commandeered barn outside Weimar. Harding was cleaning the .50 caliber for perhaps the 100th time. Delacroix was repairing a fuel line damaged by debris. Kowalczyk was writing a letter home. Try to explain what the past 9 months had been like and failing, because language couldn't capture the intensity, fear, exhilaration, and exhaustion of combat. They'd survived. Tens of thousands of gun jeep crew members hadn't. Killed by ambushes, mines, artillery, or accidents that were inevitable when operating lightly armored vehicles in combat zones. The casualty rate among gun jeep crews was never officially compiled, but anecdotal evidence suggests it was significantly higher than for infantry or armored units. The vehicles offer mobility and firepower, but almost no protection, and the aggressive tactics required to employ them effectively put crews in constant danger. But those who survived had accomplished something remarkable. They had taken a utility vehicle never intended for combat and transformed it into an effective weapons platform that influenced tactics, disrupted enemy operations, and saved lives. The gun jeep's legacy extended beyond the European theater. Similar concepts were employed in the Pacific, where Marine and Army units mounted machine guns on jeeps for base defense and patrol work, though the dense jungle terrain limited their effectiveness compared to the relatively open European landscape. Post-war, the concept evolved into purpose-built vehicles like the M38 and M151, designed with provisions for weapons mounting and more robust frames. Special operations forces adopted similar platforms, recognizing the value of mobile, flexible firepower delivered by small crews. The concept reached its apotheosis in vehicles like the Desert Patrol vehicle used by Special Forces in the 1990s, essentially a modern, refined version of the World War II gun jeep, incorporating lessons learned over 50 years, but retaining the fundamental principles of speed, firepower, and aggressive tactics. The modern technical, improvised fighting vehicles used by irregular forces worldwide directly descends from the World War II gun jeep concept, proving that the basic idea remains viable in contemporary asymmetric conflicts. The improvised modifications created by maintenance crews in 1944 established tactical patterns that influenced military vehicle design for generations. Kowalczyk returned to Detroit after the war, resumed work in an automotive plant, and rarely discussed his service. He attended a few veterans' reunions but found the experience uncomfortable. The stories other men told seemed sanitized, heroic narratives that didn't match the confusion, fear, and moral ambiguity he remembered. He kept his decorations in a drawer, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons, but never displayed them. When his children asked about the war, he offered brief, factual answers that discouraged follow-up questions. The nightmares gradually faded, though certain sounds, backfiring engines, fireworks, metal clanging, could trigger moments of visceral recall that left him shaking and disoriented. He lived until 1998, dying of heart failure at 81. And his obituary mentioned his military service in a single sentence. Harding became a union organizer in Pennsylvania, channeling the leadership skills developed in combat into labor activism. Delacroix returned to Louisiana, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 5 children on the same farm where he'd grown up. Their stories were unremarkable in a statistical sense. They joined millions of veterans who returned to civilian life and rebuilt their existence after years of disruption. But their contribution during the war had been anything but unremarkable. The Iron Wasp wasn't a war-winning weapon system. It didn't alter strategic calculations or decide major battles, but it demonstrated principles that remain relevant in military affairs. Creativity and adaptation often matter more than technological superiority. Simple, reliable systems operated by skilled, motivated crews can outperform complex platforms that require extensive support. Speed and surprise can substitute for armor and firepower when tactics are properly matched to capabilities. And ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary challenges will improvise solutions that textbooks and doctrine never anticipated. The gun jeep embodied all these principles. It was crude, dangerous, and violated engineering standards that emphasized protection and survivability. But it worked. In the hands of crews like Kowalczyk's, it became a force multiplier that disrupted enemy operations, protected friendly logistics, and contributed to Allied victory in ways that official histories rarely acknowledge. The men who operated these vehicles didn't fight for glory or recognition. They fought because the mission required it, because their friends depended on them, because innovation and courage were the only tools available to solve problems that threatened lives and operations. They succeeded because they refused to accept limitations, because they trusted each other, and because they understood that survival and success required constant adaptation to circumstances that change daily. The legacy of the Iron Wasp lives on in military innovation processes that emphasize field expedient solutions and bottom-up development. Modern armies still struggle to balance bureaucratic procurement with a need for rapid adaptation to unforeseen challenges. The tension between doctrinal orthodoxy and practical effectiveness remains constant. The gun jeeps of World War II demonstrated that soldiers closest to problems often develop the best solutions, and that institutional support for experimentation and risk-taking produces results that centralized planning cannot match. This lesson has been relearned repeatedly in subsequent conflicts, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, where ground-level innovation addressed threats and challenges that headquarters didn't anticipate and existing equipment couldn't counter. The specific technology changes with each generation, but the underlying principle endures. Trust soldiers to solve their own problems. Give them resources and authority to experiment, and institutional military effectiveness increases dramatically. The men who drove and fought from gun jeeps during World War II have largely passed into history. Their vehicles were scrapped or sold as surplus after the war, with only a handful surviving in museums or private collections. The tactics they pioneered are studied in military schools, though often without attribution to the individuals who developed them under fire. The nickname Iron Wasp has faded from common knowledge, remembered by specialists and enthusiasts but unknown to the general public. But the impact remains. Every modern military that employs mobile weapons platforms owes a debt to the sergeants and lieutenants who welded machine guns to jeep frames and figured out how to use them effectively. Every special operations unit that mounts weapons on light vehicles follows tactics refined in French forests and German villages during 1944 and 1945. And every military innovation that emerges from field necessity rather than institutional planning echoes the creativity and courage of men who refused to accept that utility vehicles couldn't become combat platforms. They prove that limitations exist to be challenged, that doctrine serves as guidance rather than constraint, and that the most powerful weapons in warfare are imagination and determination wielded by people who refuse to quit. If you want more stories of forgotten innovations that change history, subscribe now